must continue our work. Halifax Friends of Palestine has raised awareness of the Palestinian cause through all peaceful and legal means for the last 15 years. We have invited experts and published authors like Jonathan Cook and Stephen Sizer to speak at our public meetings. We have had 2 very successful Palestinian film festivals in and around Calderdale. 3 times in the last 10 years we have hosted the musicians, singers and dancers from the Largi Centre in Ida refugee camp. We have all formed lasting relationships with the people of Ida refugee camp. Exactly 11 years ago this summer, we held a week-long Palestinian cultural festival which culminated in a performance at the Peace Hall when local children from Beach Hill, Halifax High and Calder High danced and sung with our Palestinian visitors, a performance for which they had been rehearsing together all week. Last year we launched the Big Ride for Palestine from this very park. In 2016, 10 of us went to Palestine to witness the reality of living under occupation so that we would be able to talk about the issues with more authority. We have highlighted the plight of Palestinian child prisoners and lent our support to the national campaigns led by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, especially against the HSBC and Puma, to name but 2. I hope that you will continue supporting us the way you have done in the last few months. I've really been touched by your support. You've turned up in your hundreds up and down the country. I hope, in fact, please join us by leaving your email address at one of our stalls so we can keep in touch with you and let you know about our events and campaigns. None of this would be possible without the energy, enthusiasm and drive of our chair, Councillor Jenny Lynn, who has served this community for over 3 decades, especially the people of Park Ward. Please welcome my friend, your friend, Chair of Halifax Friends of Palestine. And before I finish, I'd like a good chant. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! From the river to the sea,
Palestine will be free!
From the river to the sea,
Palestine will be free!
From the river to the sea,
Palestine will be free!
Thank you so much, my good friend Perveen Hussein and good comrade, and along with myself, a founder member of Halifax Friends of Palestine. I want to thank Perveen, it was her energy and her determination that following the roadside protests that we had during the bombing of Gaza recently, that we must find a way to bring together some of you who supported those and to remind you that the struggle continues. I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody in Halifax Friends of Palestine who's been involved with this, to our stewards from the mosque who are you're very welcome and it's great to have you here, and to our lineup of speakers, and to all of you for braving the weather. And as I said just a few weeks ago, many of you took part in those roadside protests. And it's a terrible thing to say, but that's the 5th time that there's been a major onslaught on Gaza in the 15 years since we formed our organisation in June 2006. And I think 1 or 2 of you may very well even have been here in that meeting in the YMCA when Mosher Al-Farah, also from Gaza and the chair of Sheffield Palestine Solidarity Campaign, reported that already Israeli bombs were falling, not just in Gaza, but actually also over in Lebanon. And it was wonderful. There were about 150 people came there for our inaugural meeting. Bruce Kent, who's a president of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, also spoke. And 15 years ago, we really had hope that things were going to change, and things have changed. But alas, in some ways, things have changed for the worse. But nevertheless, our aim today, this afternoon, is to celebrate the resistance of the Palestinian people. One of the things which I think was absolutely amazing was the way in which people in Gaza, people inside Israel living under apartheid conditions as second-class citizens, people in the occupied West Bank, people in the Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, in the Lebanon and in Syria came together to protest really strongly about what was happening, about the threat of evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, and about the terrible incursions in Al-Aqsa Mosque. And in fact here, if I can just point it out, there's a picture at the bottom taken by my very good friend Hilly Fletcher of a little boy in red sitting on the ruins of his house in Silwan, which had been demolished by Israeli forces a mere few hours before we got there. And it was one of the most terrible and moving experiences, I think, for all of us who made that trip in 2016 to go to Palestine. Right, okay, and I think we've got some more people coming. The first of two Palestinian speakers. I'd like to introduce a young woman called Iman Al-Assa, who is from Beit Sahur, next to Bethlehem. And Iman and I first met at a meeting in Newcastle, I think, a year or two ago, and I was really impressed with her. And so we've invited her. First of all, she's currently studying in the Northeast for her doctorate. And
For having me in Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for having me in the beautiful town of Halifax. I'm pleased to be here with you today, and I will not talk about politics or history because I'm sure you know so much about that. I'm going to make it as informal and personal as possible. So, my name is Iman, I'm Palestinian. I was born to a family in exile, a family that was exiled because of political activism, because of resistance, which is why I shouldn't be here today, but I am. I grew up in the city of Bethlehem in the West Bank, and it is a sacred and holy city. It's an ancient city that is sacred for so many people around the world. But it's also a city that is surrounded by an apartheid wall, by a number of settlements, by so many checkpoints within and without the city. I grew up thinking that this is what life is like, and I did not know that another life exists, where there are no checkpoints, no borders, no soldiers, heavily armed soldiers everywhere. And I normalized that, as many Palestinians have. But then I started traveling to the West, and I saw how people are free to move whatever they want, where people were respected, treated with dignity and respect and human rights. I realized how much we have normalized military colonial occupation, how Palestinians are not given the life that humans deserve in the free world and in the 21st century. And this is my narrative, but it's also, as a Palestinian, all of our lives are shaped and defined by Israeli policies. And I'm talking about 3 million Palestinians living under military colonial occupation in the West Bank, 2 million Palestinians living under siege in Gaza, in what can only be described as a big prison, and it's not that big. 1.5 million Palestinians living as second-class citizens in the state of Israel, and 7 million Palestinian refugees living in refugee camps and in the wider diaspora. Each life of these has been shaped by the racist policies of Israel. And we have tried everything. It's a long story, but we have tried everything. We tried armed resistance, which is, of course, useless and pathetic if you think about it, because Israel is one of the mightiest military powers in the world. But we tried that and it did not work. We turned to diplomacy and negotiations, which did not work, simply because how can you negotiate with someone that does not recognize your humanity, with someone that does not see you as an equal and fellow human being? So negotiations did not work, and Palestinians were willing to compromise on historic Palestine and the right of return for the sake of achieving peace, but it was not possible. Now, I think we're at this phase where we only have one option, which is political activism and international solidarity. And that's why what you're doing is very, very important to us. It's almost the only option that we have. And I think you have a bigger part to play, simply because living in Palestine makes it very difficult for us to be politically active. There are just so many restrictions, and it's so difficult for Palestinians to speak out. And they're often being silenced by Israel and sometimes by the international community. Which is why when you amplify our voices, this means so much to us. It gives us strength to continue with our resilience and resistance and steadfastness. I was honestly surprised and even shocked when I came to the UK and I saw this amount of solidarity from people, some of whom went to Palestine and saw for themselves, and others are just people with a sense of justice and conscience. And I was so touched by people who were perhaps more Palestinian than I am, people who cared about people who are living far away. So it was amazing. And yeah, I mean, recently, especially ever since the last war in Gaza erupted and people went out to the streets, people were chanting "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and this was a bit controversial for some people. But I don't know what's controversial about it, because what we want, and at least as a Palestinian, what I see for the future, is one democratic, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state for everyone, for Muslims, for Christians, for Jews. And I don't see why is that impossible. I mean, we coexisted and lived in harmony before Zionism came along. We never had a problem with Jewish people. We consider them as cousins because we're all from the same place. So we never had a problem with that. This is not a religious conflict. So I'm always inspired by history, by our past, when we were able to live together before the imperialist project started in Palestine. And for me, this is my vision for the future. I want to see a free Palestine where everyone can live together, can coexist. And I think we can do that. But this cannot happen with the current circumstances, with the current apartheid system of Israel. This has to be dismantled, and I think the only way to do so is by international solidarity, by political campaigning, by imposing sanctions and divestment and boycott on Israel. And this is why what you're doing here is very, very important to us. And sometimes I think it's sad that we're in the 21st century and we're still protesting and campaigning for human rights, basic human rights, for decolonization, for justice, for peace. But until Palestine is free and everyone is free, I don't think we have a choice but to keep campaigning. And yeah, as a Palestinian, and here I speak on behalf of my people, we thank every and each one of you for amplifying our voices, for caring about Palestinians. And Palestine is a beautiful country, and there is war, there is conflict, but there is also a beautiful side in our culture and our country. And those who have been there know that. But hopefully one day we can welcome people from all over the world in Palestine, and we have you there in a free Palestine. And well, there's so much to say really, but I'm not going to.
We'll be free.
From the river to the sea.
Palestine will be free.
From the river to the sea.
Palestine will be free.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Occupation no more.
5, 6, 7, 8.
Israel is a terrorist state.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Occupation no more.
5, 6, 7, 8.
Israel is a terrorist state.
Welcome to Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jenny, for introducing me. My name is Tareem, and I come from Palestine, the Gaza Strip. I'm doing my master's degree at Durham University, and I'm glad that Jenny gave me this opportunity to be able to speak and explain a little bit about what it means for Gazans to live under occupation and also under a blockade. So I'll just try to give you a sneak peek of what it means to be under an ongoing Nakba since 1948 and until now. So first of all, the ongoing Nakba characteristics basically by Israeli policies and practices designed and implemented to control the maximum amount of land with the minimum number of Palestinians. Still today, hundreds and thousands of Palestinians are being evicted from their houses, and they're being trying to endure the military and structural violence of Israel's colonial expansion. Hundreds of them are being evicted only because Israelis believe that they don't have a right to exist there. Also, the very well-known rule of or principle of colonization, divide rule, also applies to Palestinians. So Israel fragments segments and also isolates Palestinian communities and lands in order to suppress the national, cultural, and also social nationality. Israel has not allowed any kind of, stretches of land that will help build Palestinian identity in the West Bank. It also has severed and blockaded the Gaza Strip for more than 15 years now in order to build a larger project of expanding its borders and expelling a larger segment of Palestinian people. So Palestinians in different areas are being subjected to different forms of Nakba. Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, they are subjected to some kind of daily Nakbas. These would include settler violence. I'm sure that some of you still remember the Dawabsha family whose house was burned in the middle of the night by Israeli settlers, and they were all found dead except for one little child who survived to witness the misery of his family and also the misery of being a Palestinian. Another form of Nakba that Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem witness is house demolishing. This does not only happen in the Gaza Strip during wars by just bombing the house. It also happens in different parts of Palestine, including East Jerusalem and the West Bank, by just simply issuing a document or a paper by military Israeli court saying that you don't have the right to exist here or that your house was illegally built, so you need to demolish it. They give you a deadline. If you don't demolish it with your own hands, they would bring bulldozers to demolish the house and you would pay the fine for that. So it's either you demolishing your own house with your own hands or paying the money for Israeli courts for demolishing your own house. Another part of the ongoing Nakba is simply the daily humiliations. There is this Israeli policy of harassing Palestinians and making every single simple life, like every single activity of life, just very hard for them. These would include segregation walls, roadblocks, and also checkpoints. While we're talking right now, there could be a child in the West Bank or probably in Hebron heading to his school, and in order to reach there, he needs to pass through or go by a checkpoint that is full of heavily armed Israeli soldiers. I have a friend in the West Bank whose her 8-year-old child believes that this is the norm. He believes that other children in other parts of the world, they all see heavily armed soldiers in order to get to their schools. And then we have Gaza, which is near and dear to my heart, my own city where I come from. I don't know how I can sum up my whole life, but it's a little bit hard. So I grew up in Gaza, suffering. I was 14 when the blockade of Gaza started, and I feel like the blockade is now part of my life. I grew up, and the blockade grew up with me. Israel started tightening up their grip on every single aspect of our life. This would include lack of every source of life, lack of electricity, lack of clean water, lack of opportunities, jobs, lack of resources, lack of medical treatment. If you were a fisherman, they would simply shoot you while you're only allowed to fish in the 12 miles that is like based on their own laws. If you're a farmer in the Gaza Strip, they could simply flood their sewage water or any extra water they don't need in your lands and in your crops, and you would just lose the source of your living. If you're a student and you receive the scholarship, they could simply just not issue a permit for you to leave, and you could, lose the dream. They could crush your life and crush your dreams. If you were, let's say if you're a patient, you'd have to wait for 2 months at least to get a permit to travel and to get medical treatment, because basically they have destroyed the health infrastructures in Gaza. My neighbor was a cancer patient and she had to wait for 2 months to get a permit. She got the permit finally, but unfortunately she died before even getting the chance to travel outside of Gaza. For me, I myself had to go through a series of the humiliations when I had to travel here. I was not able to travel through Erez, which is a checkpoint between Gaza and the Israeli occupation. I was rejected simply because, well, first of all, they don't give you a reason why you were rejected, but they just tell you that I think they took advantage of the idea of COVID-19 and the restrictions of movement, as if there wasn't enough restrictions of movement. And then I had to go through Egypt, and while of course I had to go through Egypt, I had to wait until, of course, the mercy of Egypt decides to open the borders and so on. So my course was supposed to be to begin in September, last September, but the borders were closed, so I could not travel. I asked the university if they could delay it for me. I was lucky because there was another cohort starting in January 2021. So they told me, yes, you can join the cohort starting in 2021. And I had to wait from September till January for the borders to open. Unfortunately, the borders did not open. And then on the 2nd of February, the borders opened and my course already started again. I was lucky one more time. Contacted my scholarship trustees and the university saying if I can come. They allowed me to come, but I think this is like 1 in a million chance. I don't think that other people or other Palestinians can get it. For the organization that Jenny would like me to talk about, there's an organization called We're Not Numbers. The story behind this organization is very close to my heart. Simply a very young man named Ahmed, whose brother was killed during the 2014 war. He was depressed, he could not talk about it, and he could not deal with it. So he had a friend named Pam Paley. She's a journalist. She convinced him of writing his story. She would ask him every day, "How are you, Ahmed?" And he would say, "I'm fine." And she would tell him, "No, you're not fine. You need to write about that." So he wrote the story of his brother being killed along with other 5 of his friends. And then the story went viral, and then a whole project erupted named We're Not Numbers. This project is all about mentioning the stories behind the numbers in the news, because during every single war, what you see in the news is just 1,000 were killed or 66 children were died by an Israeli bomb and so on. But again, every single man is a father, is a son, is a child, is a brother, and they have a story. So this is mainly what the project is about. If you'd like to check it, just write We're Not Numbers, Google it. You'll find hundreds of stories. They're not sad stories, they're very beautiful stories. They tell you how much we love life. It's just that we only need the chance to get it. All what I have mentioned like previously about the violations and so on, they have been happening and still happening, and also has been happening for the last 73 years. It is considered a violation of UN resolutions against the human rights and also abuses of international laws. if you're asking what's the solution, unfortunately, I'm just another Palestinian who survived at the moment, so I have zero solutions in my hand. But I can tell you one thing, as long as there's a struggle, there must be a fight. So please keep the fight, keep the BDS. I hope Jenny will tell you more details about that. Keep the fight against all of the injustices that are happening all around the world, and keep the fight for human rights, especially for Palestinians. Also keep educating others, keep spreading awareness that this is not a two sides story. It's only about discovering the truth behind the Israeli propaganda. And thank you very much. It seems that the international law right now is not in our side, or is failing us a little bit. So the only hope that we've left is in humanity, which involves people like you. I would like to thank you on behalf of my people. Thank you for being a voice for my voiceless people back home in Palestine, in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and also Palestinians in the diaspora. And thank you everyone for listening to me.
Okay, free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine! From Manchester PSC and Oldham Peace and Justice Campaign, please give him a warm Halifax welcome.
Thank you everybody, wonderful to see you all. It's fantastic that you braved the rain, fantastic that you stayed out long enough for the M62 crash to have cleared so I could finally get to see you, but it's well worth it. It was lovely seeing this sea of wave of Palestinian flags as I just came around the corner and seeing everybody still around and still well up for it. First of all, I just want to say that, believe me, the future of Palestine right now is in our hands. Okay, it really is. We have a chance now. We have a massive chance now. I've never ever known it. I was obviously doing a lot for a long time. I was in Gaza for 2 years, but I've never seen this sea change before. Okay, believe me, this is historic. This is different now. The whole world is waking up, and when Golda Meir said that the old will die and the young will forget, and when we see the amount of youth coming out for every single demonstration that are actually in Manchester leading the demonstrations now. Literally, after a few months of them joining the movement and getting involved, they are now leading the demonstrations, leading the actions, leading the initiatives. This is a massive boost for the movement, and we have no excuses. We have no excuses now. If we know that there is a blueprint, there is a way forward, there is a historic context to this with apartheid South Africa, where people kept fighting. People were just fighting to say that blacks should be treated the same as whites. That was the argument people were having to make. They fought internationally throughout the north in the UK with some of the biggest solidarity actions with the blacks in South Africa, and eventually, thanks to courageous resistance on the ground and massive support worldwide, we won. We won, at least we ended political apartheid for South Africa. There is a template there that was very clear, and it needed international solidarity, it needed boycott, it needed people like you to do a little bit more, because we are all connected with this. The UK is complicit historically, and we are connected because there is so much complicity right on our doorsteps. This was the mantra for apartheid South Africa, that actually we can affect direct change. Here in the UK, here in England, here in the north. And you all know about, obviously, the company Elbit. What is the company Elbit? Do you know Elbit? Elbit is the largest Israeli arms manufacturer. They are the largest private manufacturer. They have recently bought IMI, which is about munitions for using in the guns that shoot the protesters. They are also the largest company who are making the drones. 85% of the drones that are made by Israel are produced by this private company, Elbit. And they have factories dotted around England, and I'll tell you why this is significant. This is significant because when I was in Gaza, I was there in 2010 and 2012. I was there when in 2010 I first ventured with a Palestinian documentary maker, and he took me to this village, and it was a town called Zaytun, but it was a small little neighborhood. And he was doing a documentary about a family that was particularly ravaged by the bombing of 2008-9. Now you think of the bombings that have happened since. Well, this was the first really major onslaught of this kind. I mean, there had been various different attacks that slaughtered many. There had been many massacres, and Palestinians in Gaza were already, at that point, they'd already been under a hermetic siege. Israel pulled their settlements out of Gaza, put a lot more into the West Bank. This is illegal settlements under international law, but then they put the siege on Gaza. So under international law, it was still occupied. That means the skies, the seas, the land borders, surrounded by the most militarized army in the Middle East. And when I got to Gaza, I was just looking around, and the first thing that came to mind was, how on earth would they bomb this? This is one of the most built-up areas in the world. It's one of the most populated areas in the world. It was just lots of concrete structures, houses after houses on top of each other. These refugee camps that started off as tents and gradually became just concrete on top of concrete on top of concrete to just try and build up, because it was such a tiny enclave. It's about the size of the Isle of Wight and a population of mostly children. And I was just like, how on earth could you possibly have bombarded this entire area? Because that was the bombing of 2009. And that was 22 days, 1,400 people killed, 330 children. So this documentary maker, his name is Mohammed, he took me by the arm and he brought me to this family, and I learned a little bit about this family, and it was called the Samuni family. They were just a normal family. They weren't actually refugees. They were original Gazawi, although most of the people in Gaza, 2/3 are refugees, from having been forced from their homes in 1948. So if you knock on a door in Gaza, most people will tell you they're from a village that has been turned to rubble, or a national park in Israel a long time ago. They'll tell you they're from Bet Shersha, they'll tell you they're from Barbara, they'll tell you they're from Jaffa, they'll tell you from a place that was no longer existing. That is the history of Palestine when you knock on a door in Gaza. So I'm teaching these kids, and actually the little kids, they take me to a room, and I'm teaching English there, and the room was like corrugated iron, and it turned out actually that one of the families, of having had such a horrible trauma and had their houses destroyed by the bombs, they were still living in the chicken coop. It was obviously they'd put more corrugated iron up. And this family was attacked on the 3rd of January 2009. It was after about a week of the bombings of Gaza during that time, and they were rounded up. They were put in one building, and during that process the soldiers were actually on the ground at that point, and they charged into the houses. They shot at a lot of the family members, and for example, this particular family, the father had walked out with his old driving license that he was out when he could enter Israel in the past, and his ID card. They shot him on the spot. This was a family of 8. And they also shot his son, a four-year-old at the time, called Ahmed, and he was still alive, but he was shot, and there was smoke everywhere, and they rounded up that family and lots of other families and put 100 people in one building, and they were there for a day and a half. During that time, poor Ahmed died of his wounds. Another mother gave birth prematurely in that time, the day and a half they were in that house. They made 145 calls to the Red Cross, and they couldn't enter because the Israeli soldiers were dotted around down the roads, blocking the roads, stopping people from coming to help. They knew that they had been bombing there. They bombed all the houses around this one house. And then they bombed the house. So they'd lost about 8 members in the initial onslaught. Then they bombed the house with 100-odd family members in it after a day and a half. Again, the Israeli soldiers, at that point, people who survived were just walking off no matter what the soldiers said. They were injured. 3 people remained under the rubble for 3 days because, once again, the Red Cross and the health officials were not allowed to enter. There were many under the rubble that had died, but Amal Samuni, for example, she lay next to her dead family members for 3 days and she survived. She still got shrapnel and gets nosebleeds and headaches that's in her head. And then 2 others survived. This is under the rubble here. So this was a family that I went to see, and at the time, they was only a year later, they were still living in the chicken coop. One of the families was, and that was Amal and Mahmoud and others, and I was teaching them there, and I would often not see the parents, because for a start the father had died and the mother has to get on with things. So it was often 10-year-olds taking care of 6-year-olds and 11-year-olds taking care of 2-year-olds, because they were not left with any help. So you imagine for 3 days they were left in the rubble, and with that one bomb, 21 members of that extended family were killed. That one bomb, which was more than 8 years of any Palestinian rockets had killed of any other side. This is the complete distortion of how they try and call it a conflict, when this is just massacre after massacre, oppression after oppression. I taught little Mona Samuni. She was 11, and I didn't, you know, I was with the documentary maker at the beginning, and I went to teach them twice a week for 2 years actually, just wandering into the refugee camp. I wanted them to try and explain their story in English for a start. But I asked her, what message do you have for people in England? And she said, take care of your parents. I don't have any parents anymore, and I can't take care of them. And this is where they're still looking outward. She was 11. And still that family, I'm still in touch with them. We've sort of tried to help get them into university. We've tried to help some of the projects they've got. But I experienced the bombs, especially, well, the first bomb I experienced 2010, but when I was there in 2012, they bombed again. And they bombed all across Gaza. And it was 8 days this time. It wasn't quite the horror of 22 days in 2009. But I was there in the hospitals, and the kids were coming in one by one to the intensive care unit. There was one girl, Hanim, sadly she was 2 years old, who died right in front of me, and she was just dusty like a rag doll. And this was a horrible sight, and the parents were outside screaming and crying, and they're coming to us, you know, hoping that she might still be alive, and we knew that she'd just been hemorrhaging in the intensive care unit. They killed 32 kids in 8 days at that time, and the bombs, I can't tell you about how horrific that must be to a child, let alone me or anybody else. The power is mini earthquakes dropping around. Everything that is solid is no longer solid. Everything is crumbling around you. And this is on a population that's mostly children. And you have all the ethnic cleansing, like you're seeing with the villages Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan now in the West Bank, which is continuous. They did the big ethnic cleansing in 1948, which is why they're all refugees. And then they're continuing with what you call slow motion ethnic cleansing ever since. But this is what had happened. Even worse to the Palestinians in Gaza was this sharp edge, which is the horrific massacres that began in 2009. And there I was in 2012. Now, in the bombings of 2014, it was unprecedented what happened. Even after all the horrors that I'd seen in Gaza up close, and I was a teacher there at the university where I taught English literature, English, French, and I had classes full of women. The women were way better than the guys, by the way, absolutely country mile, and I'm seeing more and more Palestinian women and women in the movement generally, young women especially, who, for me, have got the most to offer for eventual liberation of Palestine. There is huge amounts that they are doing and that they have done, and they are leading the way. And it didn't surprise me that their average marks are about 20% higher than the guys in Gaza. But obviously there's not the same opportunities to go and do something with that. But they're terrifically bright, terrifically keen, and if there was the opportunity, they would be leaders of industry right now, believe me. But this was a wonderful experience as it happened. But in 2014, during the bombing of Gaza, this was a whole new ballgame. This was 51 days of mass onslaught of Gaza. And I was in England at the time, and we were out every day, and we were demonstrating, but I felt like we weren't doing enough. Not because I understood what the hospitals were like when it was 8 days of bombing. And believe me, anybody here that was there in those hospitals would have been screaming and shouting and running straight to take action immediately. And during the 2014, we decided, well, look, Israel somehow has got Israeli arms factories in the UK. I mean, how did they manage to get away with that? So we went on the roof of the Shenstone arms factory for 3 days in 2014. There was 9 of us, and we shut it for 3 days. And and obviously it was the first time one of the arms factories, there had been some faith groups that had done some activity there, but it was the first time we closed it down. And of course it got big news, but it also put a light on just how entrenched Israel's weapons industry is in the mass carnage of what's happening to the Palestinians. Because they are selling their weapons saying that they are battle tested, they are field tested. Now that's my students that they're talking about, that's my families and friends that I know very well in Gaza that are the laboratory, they're the lab rats for developing weapons. And they've said it themselves. If they need to test a weapon, they just send it over 10 miles just the other side of the border, and then they can test them. And that's what this humanity, this immense humanity that I experienced in Gaza, of warmth and care, that's what I experienced directly, and yet they are the ones that are helping develop the Israeli arms company's weapons by being the experimental laboratory rats for the bombings and for the testing of these new weapons. That's why Israel is a leader in the industry. So their industry depends on the mass carnage that I saw firsthand, and those kids coming into the hospitals and the screaming and shouting of the parents. And it is huge, huge, huge trauma. We've all lost loved ones, of course we have, and we all know how hard that is. But when it happens again and again and again, and this was the third bombing in 5 years, so a 5-year-old child would have had that level of trauma and carnage. I met a woman in Gaza where she didn't make any sound anymore. She was upstairs making noises. We were speaking to the father downstairs, and he said she's just lost it since she lost her second son. She was just making noises. That's all we heard. This is the legacy of what happens. It's not just people dying, it's the families that are left behind. How do you cope with that? How on earth do you cope? They say that the kids don't have post-traumatic stress disorder, they have chronic stress, because there's no post. You can't get out and look back at Gaza and say, God, that was awful, how can I regenerate, how can I get better? You're in there all the time, you can't leave. Most people can't leave. So there I was on the roof of that factory, the arms factory in Shenstone, and at that point, honestly, one thing you think I'd rather not be anywhere else right now. At least we've hit some of the most complicit places, because actually we have a lot more in the tank. The one thing I left, despite all this horror and carnage that I saw and all the families that I'm still in touch with, it's the spirit that always keeps you uplifted, to know that we've all got so much more in the tank. Because when you're faced with that horror, it also brings out the reserves in you that you never knew you had. So when we're on the roof, it just felt exactly right, and that's exactly what happened. Now, sadly, on the roof, while I was there, one of my this was a drone engine factory in Shenstone, Staffordshire. While we were on the roof, I got the news that one of my students, her name was Huda, she'd got married by then and had 2 little babies, that a drone had bombed their family, killed my student Huda and her 2 little babies and her husband and her mother-in-law, all with one bomb. If ever there's a direct connect to what we have here in these buildings that look like average biscuit factories or just, any industrial building, and they're making these killer weapons and they're owned by the worst regimes in the world whose profit depends on the deaths of my students. She used to come into my class early on. She was funny, she was quirky, she would want to have a chat with me about her getting married or finding out what I was doing, and she was very, very funny. But this is what happened, and I couldn't believe it. We were all in shock. She was from the refugee camp, everybody knew her and her family. And that's just one story, because that's one entire family wiped off the citizen registry. Well, there was 90 entire families wiped off the citizen registry in 2014. 2,200 people, 500 children, and yet still we watch on. Still people are just sitting there, the governments are looking on. Still the media was still trying to cover for what Israel was doing. I mean, it's thanks to the strength and the courage of the Palestinians that actually this story is now changing, because they have stood up. And even after all this, in 2018-19, they marched. And I was on some of the marches in Gaza when they'd started quite a few years earlier. And there was kids there running around, and he was like running towards the fence there, and there was Israeli snipers just standing there coolly with the gun, or standing next to the Jeep, leaning up. And they would just take pot shots, and a guy, Ahmed Deeb, 21-year-old, was killed right about a yard from me. But another guy was running towards the fence, and he said, he's got the flag, and he's shouting, and that's all he's got, the flag. And I'm like, look, there's a soldier there, mate, just wait back here a minute. And he says, look, I'd rather die standing than die in my bed. Because that's the choice he has as a young kid in Gaza. What other choice do you have? I heard other things like, look, I'm dead already. This is, what future you have when there's 50% unemployment, because Israel, if you walk around in Gaza, you've got F-16s in the sky, that's your sky. You go to the land borders, you've got jeeps and you've got snipers shooting at the farmers, and then you go to the sea and you see the gunships that are on the horizon dotted along there, and they are shooting at the fishermen, destroying the fishing industry. That is what you see in Gaza. That's what a child sees in Gaza. We talk about horizons and reaching for the stars. Well, what if there's an F-16 or drones making this horrific, deafening noise, reminding everyone of the trauma of the bombings? What if you've got gunships along the sea? It's not such a great view anymore. What if you're seeing jeeps and snipers shooting at school children as they go to school in the farming areas, and you can't farm your land, the best arable land, which is by the border in Gaza on that side? This is exactly what Israel is trying to do, to pulverize an entire population, and that's purely because they're born Palestinian. And I thought after apartheid South Africa, we'd got to a point where we said nobody should be entirely discriminated against because of who they're born as. Not anymore. And yet here we are, the whole world is watching it, and then you get the extra mass murder that's going on in Gaza right now. But still they marched. Still they marched, and they marched in 2018-19, and they kept marching. And yes, they stood. And yes, many were killed. Israel shot 250 protesters. 100 had amputations because they kept shooting them in the leg, including some that they knew were sports stars and footballers, so they never played again. And as well as that, 6,000 were injured with live ammunition. That's what protesters face there. But they raised the story. Remember the medic that was killed? Razan. What was the second? Yazan Anajar, yeah, that's right. Who was standing there, and she was just coming to aid a lot of the protesters. There were journalists. There was people in wheelchairs, and obviously many children and elderly that were shot during